Alright, today I want to focus on two movies with very similar stories. One obviously heavily influenced by the other decades later, and we're involved now with two doctors who have long since crossed the line into insanity and obsession that use their surgical knowledge to help out their daughters in one way or another, whether that be in hopes of fixing the damage that's already been done, or to take vengeance after it's too late. And yeah, so let's just go right into this. Starting with, we're going to start with Eyes Without a Face, I think, which kind of started off this. When you look at French movies, you'll notice how they did tackle the horror genre. Like, those movies were out there at the time. This would have been the 1959-1960 area. But you'll notice that they didn't really kind of tackle the more, I guess, traditional horror would be the term, because right around this time, obviously American movies were kind of starting to get into it, and then there was what Hammer was doing in the UK, and then there were certainly movies out there like Diabolique that were doing this, but not really in the way that just really went in and showed us stuff that we weren't really sure we could see back then, to my understanding. Obviously, I can't speak for 30 years before I was born, but you get the idea. So, going into this, it's clear we're going to have a different approach, because when you look at the story of the movie, where we have the doctor who I guess back in the day would be considered the mad scientist, and he has his apprentice. Here it's Louise, who goes out, gets the girls for him, or dumps their bodies if need be. And in another sense, like in another movie, it's like if you were to see this as, say, the movies that we were getting like in the 30s and 40s, that were the really cheesy mad scientist movies with like Bela Lugosi or Vincent Price or something. And it's like you can imagine this story back then, but this is just yet another case of it's all about execution. Like, like that execution changes absolutely everything, because if you were to take this story back then, number one, we definitely would not see what we see. This one definitely takes it a step further, which may have to do, which, you know, may be helped by how much later it was than this particular group. But you look at stuff like the plot seems very much like out of a Vincent Price movie or something, or it's like, stuff like, what was that movie with, I think it was Bela Lugosi, where he, like, there was, like, the winged creature, and he had, like, a cologne that he would put on people, and the cologne would attract the creature and attack them. It almost seems like it could be in that mad scientist era, but the execution tells such a different story here. Starting with, obviously there's this opening scene when it's clear we're starting off with the mysterious. It's definitely got an interesting tone to start with, because we're dealing in the mysterious, we're not quite sure what we're looking at or what's taking place, or anything of that sort. But the music that's kind of serves as the theme to this movie that keeps coming in and out of it, it kind of feels like it's at the start of, like, it sounds like the start of a Blake Edwards comedy or something. But then as it goes forward and you realize the disturbing subject matter very quickly, then you really start to realize what you're in store for. And a lot of this has to do with the black and white. Obviously this was 1959-1960, so at this point black and white is pretty much a choice, and not just because that's what we have. And a lot of the images really come through with this, but one thing that really stands out in particular, where I think the black and white plays a really big part, is this image that is now forever in movie history, one of the most recognizable in movie history, and that is his daughter's mask, just the blank white. And the thing about this that makes it so jarring is how it gives her face this kind of emotionless stillness, and the only thing that seems alive in her is her eyes. And the great thing about this that the black and white pulls off is that if this were in color, you can tell it would be pretty distinguishable where the mask ends and her skin begins. But with the way this black and white is and the way it's shot, there's really no, it seems like there's no, and you can kind of, like every now and then you get an angle where you can tell, but with the way the colors do not change, it just seems like this is her whole kind of physique. It's just this blankness in the eyes are the only thing about her that's there, especially when she's sitting still. So I thought the black and white really did it a favor in that sense in making her such an iconic image in not just horror movie history, but movie history in itself. And so you go into this, and I was talking about how there's stuff that you kind of see in this that you wouldn't have seen prior. And the thing about this is that it's something that we really obviously take for granted today. Because you look at this movie and you hear how it's considered like a classic masterpiece of horror cinema and all that, and it's like a lot of the impact with this movie is the gore that is shown. And it's like you look at movies today and it's like when you say the movie having a lot of its impact come from the gore shown is usually a criticism and makes the movie worse. But when you go back to this, it's not just the fact that we do see it, but the way it's revealed to us. Because there is the, obviously when we start seeing the incisions, you know, in late 50s, early 60s, we're not expecting to see that. It's to my understanding they actually had this at a film festival back then and people just started fainting. Like 7 people or something, just gone at this. And the thing about this is that when we see... Well, the first time we see her without her face, it is through the blurriness, as she's just barely, you know, coming out of this induced sleep or whatever, and we see it through the blur, and that is more than enough to have the impact. And so we get used to that, and that's already jarred us, but then there's the later scene when we actually see him pulling the face off, and it's getting closer and closer to being a reveal, and we kind of start to think, well, they won't actually just show it straight forward because this is a shot that's like clearly in the foreground. There's like there's nothing obscuring it. There's no blurriness. We're just right here on this shot of the face, and it's like, so they're bound to cut away or something, or they won't show us because the last time we saw it, it was all blurry. So we're in the clear. No. You anticipate and you anticipate and you anticipate something to interrupt this cut, and nothing does. And just before the fade out, we get the whole shebang. This whole face removal, and that's the use of that and the way they build up to it is what makes it so jarring, and the way they use previous scenes to kind of trick you into thinking you know what you're going to see when you don't. And so that's obviously something that really makes an impact as to the kind of effect the gore brings on, and not just, you know, just the fact that it exists is supposed to be what makes you react, but the way they meticulously went about how they showed it and used previous scenes to build up to that is what makes it so great. And it's not just the gore, obviously. Like I said, they use the unknown quite a bit, like the opening scene when it's clear we're seeing something a bit disturbing, but we don't really know what's happening or why. And we kind of get to slowly figure that out as it goes, and the more pieces are unraveled, the more disturbing it becomes, even more so than when we didn't know what it was. It's like, can we go back to not knowing what it was, because I was still incredibly unsettled, but at least I didn't know what it was. So I do like the way that's played out, and of course, obviously, the way other things are shot, like the cemetery, and just how kind of unnatural everything looks, whether it be the shape of things or the inside of the tomb and all the stuff, the way it contrasts with the exterior and the night and all that. And then it's... I struggled to say this because in fear of sounding like pretentious, but this is a movie to where it kind of feels like the images themselves have feeling. And it's not just, and it's, on top of the imagery, this also has a lot to do with the editing as well. When we get stuff like when the way something is like at a particular angle, or the way we see it right before it cuts away from something, it's like, it's almost like through the images we can feel the shock, or the feel, or the fear, or the uneasiness. And there's also moments where it's like the movie is like come to life by itself, where it's like we're lingering on something that's mysterious, and it's like we're not really cutting away because it's like the movie wants to know what this thing is, so we're gonna linger on it until we find something out, and just the way scenes play out like that, and it's I like I said, that's also a big edit or a big credit to the editing as well. And despite the fact of what the story is and the content of it, it's kind of surprising to find out how much sensitivity is put into the characters for the most part. Even the Doctor himself, after a while, kind of starts to show kind of a human, even if it's not, you know, full. There is some remorse in him, especially when mostly towards his daughter, when the effects start to take their effect. But obviously, this all stemmed from the fact that he feels remorseful about what he recklessly did to her to begin with. But then those moments toward the end when we just kind of see him sitting down and just kind of like he's wearing down. And there are some moments in there that actually kind of bring humanity in somebody that probably in another movie would just be seen as the mad scientist or doctor or whatever. But then his daughter in general, how even though she has to remain expressionless through most of the movie, like 95% of the movie, there's still definitely moments in there that they add in, like when she goes to see the dogs, and it's like everything with how unnatural she looks here. It's almost like everybody would recoil to see her, and she has a feeling of what she looks like underneath, so she feels there's obviously that isolation. But when she goes to the dogs are like, we know just in general, dogs are like really unprejudiced and just friendly to, and love pretty much everything at first sight. So there's that nice moment where we get to see that interaction when it's like something still, you know, will show her unconditional love regardless of what she looks like, which is a really powerful moment amidst what we've seen prior to this and we'll see later. And the way that that she's definitely a sympathetic character because we know that she's descending into insanity. And the thing about that is that we know that this follows. The insanity that follows was brought on to her by what was supposed to be helping her. Where the whole, we'll keep her confined because, number one, obviously society would just absolutely reject anything that looks like this. And secondly, to do these procedures that are supposed to fix her and get her back to normal are ultimately what leads her to still a conclusion that she probably should get to, but we know this has long since driven her to complete insanity. So it's like kind of a bittersweet thing here, what ultimately becomes of her. And what we can only imagine becomes of her once she's wherever she ends up after she goes into the woods. And you can just tell when you see later movies how much influence this movie had. It is like countless. In the way, because you look at it, like, let's say, the Twilight Zone episode, Eye of the Beholder, one of the most famous episodes. I don't know that there is an influence because they were, like, the same year, but it's worth noting the similarities, and not just in their, what goes on, but the themes as well. But then there is, like, Halloween. I think Carpenter said that the mask was an inspiration for Michael's, William Shatner mask, just the white blankness to give it that, just kind of the blankness of it is what's so fear-inducing about it. Even the likes of Tim Burton's Batman, with that subplot with the woman whose face was damaged and she had to wear the same mask. Just even in random movies like that. And then, like, John Woo, obviously, there is the obvious connection to, I guess he took inspiration from the facial procedures when he made Face Off, on top of the fact that one of the final images in the movie is doves, which ended up becoming one of his trademarks. And then, of course, the last scene of Holy Motors, when the actress herself is in that movie and puts the mask on. Never quite sure what the purpose of that in the context of Holy Motors was, except to say, hey, remember when I was in this movie? But still, it's a nice moment and a nice callback to show that this movie still very much has a very powerful influence through movies throughout history, especially in this genre, but even not. There's, like, even you could say, like, the scenes where Louise is, you know, grabbing bodies or disposing of bodies feels very... You can kind of sense the influence in Under the Skin later on. So there's that, and basically, just looking back on it and realizing that it was more or less Franju coming forth and saying to other filmmakers in that era, like, did you guys know we could do this? Like, we could show this? And it was apparently he was very passionate about the genre and being able to take it in those places that a lot of French filmmakers weren't really doing at the time. I guess possibly because they feared being, like, you know, schlocky or looking like B movies or whatever. But he showed that you could really, really do something very artistic with the genre and really show it off in a very visually masterful way and really change the execution of the content. And that's... I imagine that's a few of the reasons why this movie is considered an absolute classic in its genre. So that's what that is. And then going on to The Skin I Live In with Almodovar now, where it's abundantly clear he took a lot of inspiration from this, but obviously the main inspiration would have been the French novel Tarantula, which obviously if you read up on it, you can see where he got the concept, but then he, like, really started to go off that story and start to kind of create his own creature here, if you will. And yeah, it's stuff that we've seen him deal with before, particularly the identity themes we've seen in a lot of Almodovar movies before. And speaking of the things that he has done before, you'll notice the casting of Antonio Banderas in the lead role, which the thing I really love about this the most is, obviously Almodovar's gone to some very dark places in his filmography, but there seems to be something about Banderas that really brings out that dark side in a really interesting and fun way. When you look at their previous movies, like, well, like, if you look at a non-Banderas movie like Talk to Her, when we see that that movie went in, to put it as mildly as possible, morally questionable directions. But when you look at some of his Banderas movies, like Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, or Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, you'll start to realize that these are definitely things where they go in dark places, but they're usually done in a comedic style. Especially Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down goes into this, like, that movie should be a thriller with its setup. But they made it this really weird-ass erotic comedy. And so it was very exciting to see that he would be working with Banderas again in another very dark direction that would not be taking the comedy approach by any means. And so going into this, and his performance here, because I've praised Banderas to the heavens many times, this is yet another reason to. The way he plays this character, once again, like with Eyes Without a Face, you would think that this character would just be your kind of... just on paper would come off like the stock mad scientist, or in this case mad doctor type. But we get this scene towards the beginning when he is explaining what it is exactly that he wants to do, before he is given permission to not given permission to do this. And the way he's explaining this, there's such a clear logic and an understandable motive and drive with the way he describes this, how he's talking about, we have so many different ways of improving objects, but we're never working to improve the human race physically. And to, like, make it stronger and make it more easier to withstand just the bad shit that can happen to what is essentially a fragile thing. And on top of this, we have the other motive of the fact that his wife was killed and burned to death in a car accident. And there is just so much driving this that you realize this does not come off like the ravings of a lunatic. It does not come off like the ravings of a mad doctor. This is somebody who's actually driven, trying to find these, you know, scientific breakthroughs to help the human race, on top of, obviously, his more sinister projects, obviously. but but we'll get into those. And the thing about this movie is just the way that it unravels, because obviously we have, you know, a lot of movies have the non-linear timeline. But the thing here is, watching this, because the way this movie works, you always think, it seems, there's always that mystery that there's something you're not quite sure exactly what's happening, or what kind of situation we're actually in. And then as it goes, it kind of seems like we're going in one direction, and you can kind of figure out what it's going. But then we'll go in another direction, and it'll feel like we're on something totally unrelated, or something that we're not quite sure, like maybe it's like a parallel thing, because there's no possible way all these things intersect. But that's the beauty of it, is yes, it all comes together in one product. Whenever we go in one direction and we realize where we're going, and then we go over here to something else that seems like it's totally off, we're just headed right back in that direction. We're all coming to the one point. And obviously this ultimately leads to what has to be, it's a twist worthy of being put up next to The Usual Suspects and The Crying Game and The Sixth Sense. And the way we so gradually kind of get to that, to the point that the audience, there's the point in time where, usually in those movies, there's like one scene devoted to the twist, where it's like, this is happening, and then we twist in one scene, and it's like you're telling the audience, now this is what's happening, and people react to that. But with this movie, it so gradually gets there. It's kind of like a game of, like, every time I meet somebody that's seen this movie, the first question I want to ask is, when did you know? Because I feel like it's going to be a different moment for everybody, because of how it's like at any particular time in this one fraction of when we're starting to head in that direction, it's kind of like, it would be interesting to see this with a crowd and watch the gradual realization. And I think that's really the beauty of this, and it definitely, like, in movies like that where it's all one scene, it's almost like a twist can easily be seen as a gimmick. But here, it's such a huge, important part of the movie. Kind of in the, you could say about The Crying Game as well. To where it's actually just, it feels more like a starting point, and more of a, it makes the movie make sense. So that's definitely worthy of that, and I that's not necessarily to say that everything is like that. I know this movie gets a lot of praise for its lack of exposition. People like to say it has like no exposition whatsoever, which is entirely not true. Because there are definitely moments where like when Norma's doctor is explained to him how she just has trouble being around, she can't be around men anymore, and the whole psychological way of how she got to that point and what it's going to be for her now. There's the moment where Aurelia is telling the story of how her sons came to be who they are, and there's a lot of exposition here, but the thing is just how it's done, and it's done well enough to where it doesn't necessarily feel like we're just kind of, it feels like it has to explain everything it's doing. It does help the flow, and it does point us in directions that maybe aren't as important as the stuff that's progressed without exposition, but yeah, it's still in there, but it is done well enough. And another thing, too, is when it comes to dialogue in foreign movies, I tend to try to give them the benefit of the doubt as much as I can, because it's always the question of, something can come off like really, you know, stilted in dialogue in subtitles, but it's like, if you were to hear it and understand it in the other language, maybe it would flow better, and it's like there's just something maybe there's something lost in translation. So it's always kind of hard for me to judge dialogue in foreign movies when I'm basing it on a translation, so I try not to get too much into that. And then, of course, something Almodovar is very much known for, his visual style, and this is definitely no exception. Where, obviously, the different sets are they all feel very distinctive while being usually normal locations, but even, like, in Banderas' house, just every room kind of has, like, its own personality, but then there's also visual touches, like, stuff you would probably never think of if you were making your own movie, like, the scene when Morolia's son comes after he's robbed the place and he needs a place to stay, and he shows up in this tiger costume. And the thing about it is this scene would still be suspenseful regardless. When he realizes that Vera's in the house and he starts to look for her. But the thing is, you watch these scenes play out, and it's like, if he wasn't in that very bright, standout tiger costume, this scene would be suspenseful, but would not be near be doing the visual etching in your mind that it's doing if it didn't have that little detail in it. It just adds like a whole new personality to the scene, which would have worked without it, but just makes it stand out and pop even more because they added that detail. And you can find that a lot in a lot of his movies with stuff like that. But another detail I noticed, technically speaking, was the sound is a particular standout in this movie, and not necessarily in the traditional sense, but like you, when I say that, you would think like maybe the lab scenes or something, but it's really anytime Banderas is in the house and it's just the two of them, because every sound feels individual, and it kind of makes everything it kind of makes everything more, I guess, engrossing, I guess you could say, because every time, like, usually there's like a blending of sounds or whatever, but it feels like every single sound in these scenes are individual. Like, his footsteps feel really heavy, and when he sound really heavy, even when he's on the rug, and then when he takes his coat off, and it's like everything makes a sound more amplified than it initially would. And it kind of makes you anticipate like every single moment and every single movement with the way they did that. And it adds a more kind of, edgy, kind of, like I said, engrossing thing about these scenes that seem, in any other sense, really have nothing going on. But still stand out in that way because of that. So, yes, it has all this stuff going for it. If there's one problem I have with The Skin I Live In, it is the fact that not only do we have the moments when we see how driven Banderas is by not only his wife's death, but what happens to Norma as well. And we see him, like, when he's talking about how, she should be in normal clothes, she shouldn't be in that gown, and the way it just worries him with what's going on with her, and we see his love for her in these scenes. But as it goes on and we get towards the end, and he starts to come off more like just a villain, more or less, and we start to see her escape after she's pieced everything together. And there's a moment, obviously the very last moment in this movie, is what could be a very emotional moment. I don't know if he was intentionally avoiding being overly emotional with this movie in general, because it does kind of have that coldness to it just, inherently. But it feels like the last 15 to 20 minutes or so of this movie should be a lot more emotionally powerful than it is. It's definitely effective in other ways, but as far as having like an emotional impact, especially when we realize where the characters are coming from, it just kind of feels like it stops before it can do that. And this moment when he or she sees the mother, and he says his name, and "This is me," and we realize this is going to be the big reveal, and this could be like a big scene, but before the mother can even react to this at all in any way, the movie is over. And I guess you could argue if that's necessary, but it kind of felt like what we were building to. But then it just kind of seems to want to stop as soon as we get to this point. Like, really the only point was, he does find his identity again, which obviously is, like I said, identity and gender, just in general, are themes that Almodovar has explored often, which may also possibly take away the impact, because it's not maybe subject matter that's particularly surprising coming from him. I don't know, but it does feel like there's something kind of missing here when we get close to the end, so I would say that's kind of the one thing holding it back and makes it not as powerful as, say, Eyes Without a Face, where really one of the things that really brings it out and really makes it impactful, especially the ending, is that humanity we saw in the characters is such a huge strength to Eyes Without a Face, especially being about a movie a woman whose identity is just a blank slate, but it's still able to pull that off, I think really makes it stand out. And maybe The Skin I Live In could have benefited more from that, but it does certainly stand on its own in regards to all the other things it's doing really right. So that's what we have here. So yeah, one more weekend of these, and then October will be done for, and we will see what's going on. I'm going to try to get a lot more reviews that I am seeing, like a lot of the horror movies that are coming out I'm going to kind of catch all at the same time. I've been seeing every other week or so I've been catching the animated movies that have been coming out, but I haven't reviewed them yet, so I'll probably just put all the animated movies in one video, all the horror movies in one video, and then the rest of whatever. I know Suburbicon is coming. Jigsaw might just be in that horror video or whatever. So yeah, we'll get it all figured out if that interests you. So yes. So yeah, until all of that, I think we're done here.